The morning my ex-husband stood on a stage and told 400 people he was still caring for me, that I was no longer capable of caring for myself. I was standing in the back of the room, holding a brown leather briefcase I had carried since my first day in the JAG Corps. I watched him adjust the microphone. I watched him smile at the crowd. I watched Brigadier General Kathleen Marsh sitting in the front row with her hands folded in her lap, and I watched the moment she stopped clapping. She turned toward the back of the room. Her eyes found mine. She stood up. Stephen was still talking. He hadn't noticed her move. He was telling the audience about sacrifice, about what it means to love someone through difficulty, about the quiet dignity of caring for a spouse whose health had declined. He had been practicing that speech. I could tell by the pauses. General Marsh walked down the center aisle. 400 people watched her do it. She stopped in front of me. She stood at attention. She raised her hand in salute. Colonel Walsh. That was all she said. On the stage behind her, I heard the sound of something hitting the floor. I didn't need to look. I knew what it was. Stephen had dropped the award. I want to tell you how I got to that room. But to understand it, you need to understand what happened 18 months before and what happened to a man named Gerald Pruitt 4 years before that. Because the night Stephen's company was frozen, the night his contracts were canceled, and his pension flagged for federal review, the night he looked across a courtroom at the woman he had spent 11 months trying to erase that night was not the beginning of anything. It was the end of something he had been doing for a very long time. My name is Diana Walsh. I am 48 years old. I spent 22 years as a judge advocate in the United States Army, the last 9 of them as a prosecutor. I handled 63 cases of military fraud, financial misconduct, and criminal conspiracy against federal institutions. The largest was a case involving $4.2 million in misdirected defense funding, a case my colleagues still refer to internally as the one that set the standard. My call sign, from my years working intelligence-adjacent investigations, was Cypher. I want to tell you this not to impress you, but because it matters for what comes next. Because Stephen spent 11 months building a story in which I was a woman who could no longer be trusted to manage her own affairs. And for that story to make sense to you, for you to understand how close it came to working, you need to know exactly who he was trying to unmake. I retired from active service at 46, not because I wanted to. A stroke, mild by clinical standards but consequential by any other measure, left me with a handful of things that didn't belong in a courtroom. A slight slur that appeared when I was tired, occasional word-finding pauses in the middle of sentences, a dependency on the VA system for ongoing care that I had never anticipated, and did not know how to navigate the way I knew how to navigate a legal brief. I recovered 90% of what I had been. Most people meeting me for the first time would not have noticed anything, but in a system that runs on sharp edges and decisive language, 90% can feel like an enormous distance from 100. Stephen had been my husband for 14 years. He had also been my commanding officer for the last 3 of those years in JAG, which is a complicated thing to admit, and a more complicated thing to have lived. I believed we had kept the two things separate. I believed he had been fair in how he handled the overlap, or as fair as any person can be when they hold formal authority over someone they sleep beside. That belief, I now understand, was one I had constructed carefully over many years because the alternative that he had been managing me from the beginning, that the authority and the intimacy had always been part of the same architecture, was something I could not afford to examine too closely while I was still inside it. He was good at what he did. That matters too. Stephen Hargrove was not a fool or a blunt instrument. He was strategic and patient and charming in the particular way that institutions reward the kind of charm that makes people in positions of authority feel comfortable, that makes them feel their judgment is being confirmed rather than manipulated. When he spoke, he always sounded reasonable. When he disagreed, he always found a way to make the disagreement feel like concern. When he lied, he told lies that were built carefully around the shape of the truth, so that anyone checking the edges would find something solid. I know this because I spent 22 years learning to identify exactly that kind of construction. I did not apply that knowledge to my own marriage until it was almost too late. 6 months after I retired, I had the stroke. Stephen was attentive, in the way that he could be present, organized, handling the logistics of hospital visits and medication schedules with the efficiency I would have admired in a different context. He drove me to appointments. He spoke with the doctors. He sat in on consultations and took notes and asked the right questions. I noticed, the second time, that he was doing most of the talking. I told myself that was practical. I was still recovering. My speech was slower than it had been. And slow speech in a medical consultation is a liability. Doctors calibrate their explanations to what they hear, and what they heard from me in those early months was hesitation and gaps. Stephen filling those gaps felt, in the moment, like assistance. The first appointment I remember clearly is a Thursday in November, 8 months after I retired. A follow-up with the VA physician overseeing my neurological recovery. Stephen and I sat across from Dr. Ellison, a quiet man in his 50s who had the slightly exhausted manner of someone who had been underfunded for too long. Dr. Ellison asked me how I was experiencing my recovery. I told him I was doing well, that my word retrieval had improved significantly over the previous 2 months, that I had begun reading case files again in my personal time, something I'd been doing to keep my mind active, and had found I could process complex legal language without difficulty. Stephen made a small sound. Not a laugh. Something quieter. A small exhale of air that managed to carry an entire editorial inside it. Dr. Ellison looked at him. He has good days, Stephen said. His tone was warm with concern. She works very hard. I don't want to contradict her. She's had real progress. But there are moments, especially when she's tired, that are more difficult than she tends to acknowledge. The word-finding issues. The frustration when things don't come. She sometimes doesn't remember describing symptoms that she described to me the previous evening. I looked at my husband. That's not accurate, I said. He smiled at Dr. Ellison. That particular smile. The one that was soft and sad and said, "This is what I'm dealing with. Isn't it difficult? Don't you feel for me?" "Diana," he said, very gently. "You don't always know when it happens. That's part of the symptom profile. There are moments in which you see something so clearly that it takes the air out of the room. Not because the thing is new, but because you have been looking at it for years without naming it, and when it finally names itself, the ground shifts under everything you thought you understood." I sat in that chair and I understood what was happening. I did not show that I understood. That was the most important decision I made in that room. I had spent 2 decades teaching myself to control what my face did when my mind received new information. I used that training in the office of a VA physician in Fayetteville, North Carolina on a Thursday afternoon in November, and I kept my expression neutral, and I let the appointment end the way Stephen needed it to end. In the car on the way home, he asked if I was tired. I said I was fine. He patted my hand. That night, after Stephen fell asleep, I went to the kitchen table, and I opened the briefcase. Brown leather, worn at the corners, a small brass lock I had replaced twice in 22 years. I had carried it since my first day in uniform. Inside, I kept what I had always kept. A copy of everything that mattered. Every document with my name on it. Every record that might one day need to be verified. The habit was not strategic when I first formed it. It was simply the orientation of a person who had seen too many institutional errors to trust that the system would retain what it was supposed to retain. I took out a notepad. I wrote the date. I wrote the name of the physician. I wrote verbatim the exchange I had just witnessed. Then I started going back through my memory, appointment by appointment, looking for the pattern I had missed while I was too close to it to see it. There were 7 appointments in 8 months. Stephen had attended 5 of them. In 4 of those 5, I could remember him speaking about my symptoms in ways that contradicted what I had told him privately. Small contradictions, framed as corrections. The kind of corrections that any caring spouse might offer. The kind that, repeated over time, in front of a medical professional who is building a clinical picture of a patient, add up to something else entirely. I wrote until 3 in the morning. Then I put the notepad in the briefcase. I locked it. I went to bed. I did not sleep. The money moved on a Wednesday, 6 weeks later. I discovered it the way I discovered most things in that period, by checking. After the VA appointment, I had made a private discipline of checking everything. The joint account, the investment accounts, the VA benefit summary, the mail. Not because I had evidence of anything yet. Because I had recognized the pattern, and in 22 years of prosecution work, pattern recognition is what separates the people who catch things from the people who miss them. $23,000, transferred from our joint account to a new account I did not recognize, in a name I did not have access to. I opened the banking app. I stared at the number. Then I called the bank. The customer service representative answered. I explained that I was inquiring about a transfer from my account. She pulled up the record. "And you are the account holder?" she asked. Yes. Diana Walsh. Joint account with Stephen Hargrove. A pause. Longer than it needed to be. Ma'am, are you the legal guardian on this account? Or the ward? I held the phone very still. I'm sorry, I said. Could you repeat that? She repeated it. I asked her what that terminology referred to. She became careful in the way that customer service representatives become careful when they realize they may have said something they shouldn't. She told me she was not able to provide legal interpretation, but that I could speak with the branch manager. I thanked her and hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for 4 minutes. I know the duration because the clock on the microwave was in my line of sight, and I timed it the way I time everything without deciding to. Then I picked up my phone and called the only lawyer I knew who I also trusted, which is a shorter list than it sounds. His name was Andrew Choi. We had worked 3 overlapping cases in my final years in JAG. He was now in private practice in Raleigh, 70 miles from Fayetteville. I called him at 8:47 in the morning and told him I needed to see him that day. He heard something in my voice that made him say yes immediately. 2 hours later, I was sitting across from him in his office with the briefcase on the table between us. I told him about the VA appointments. I told him about the transfer. I told him about the phone call with the bank. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I had always respected about him. He did not perform listening, he simply did it. When I finished, he pulled up several databases on his computer. He typed, he read, he stopped. He turned the monitor toward me. On the screen was a court filing, a petition for legal guardianship, submitted to the Wake County court system 7 weeks earlier. Petitioner, Stephen Hargrove. Subject, Diana Walsh. Grounds cited, cognitive impairment affecting financial decision-making and personal safety. Attached to the petition was a medical summary from Dr. Ellison at the VA. In it, Dr. Ellison had documented what I had described to him in our appointments, but the summary did not read the way those appointments had felt. Where I remembered telling him I was improving, the document read as ongoing deterioration. Where I had described successful engagement with complex material, the summary cited inability to reliably assess own cognitive limitations. And the diagnosis listed at the top of the summary, the diagnosis I had never heard Dr. Ellison use in any appointment, read, progressive cognitive decline, moderate severity. I read it 3 times. Andrew was quiet. I put my hand flat on the table. I said, I want you to tell me about every signature on this document. Everyone. He looked at me differently after that. I could see the recalibration happening in real time, the shift from concerned friend to professional assessment of whether the person across the table was exactly what she appeared to be, or more. He told me about the signatures. There were 3 that required his attention: the physician's, the notary's, and the witness signature on the guardianship petition itself. The witness was listed as Vanessa Cole, with an address in Durham that corresponded to the registered office of Stevens Defense Consulting Company. I wrote everything down. I did not thank Andrew with the warmth of someone who had just received terrible news. I thanked him with the precision of someone who had just received exactly the information they needed to begin. He asked me, carefully, what I planned to do. I told him I needed a few days. I told him to keep the folder. I told him not to mention it to anyone. I went home. I made dinner. Stephen asked about my day. I told him I had gone for a walk and stopped at the library. He said that sounded nice. He seemed relaxed. He seemed, I thought, like a man who believed the hard part was already over. In a drawer in my study, behind a box of old case files I had never unpacked from the move, I kept a second set of records. My complete medical history, from the initial stroke diagnosis forward, not the VA copies, my personal copies, obtained directly from the imaging centers and the specialists, outside the VA record system, at my own cost. It was not strategic when I started doing it. It was simply what I had always done. The system loses things. You don't have to. I spent 3 evenings going through them, page by page, alongside the documents Andrew had pulled from the court filing. I laid them on the table in chronological order. I compared them. I used a red pen, the same way I had marked up briefs for 2 decades. And I noted every discrepancy between what my actual records said and what Dr. Ellison's summary for the guardianship petition said. There were 19 material discrepancies. 14 were omissions, things my records showed that the summary did not mention. 5 were active mischaracterizations, things the summary stated as fact that directly contradicted what the records showed. On the 4th evening, I called a former colleague from JAG. Her name was Lieutenant Colonel Reyes, retired 2 years before me, now living in Virginia. We had worked together for 7 years. She was the best evidence analyst I had ever known. I asked her if she would look at something for me, off the record, not as legal advice, just as a second set of eyes. She said yes before I finished the sentence. I drove to Virginia. She looked at the documents for 2 hours while I sat in her kitchen and drank coffee. When she finished, she looked up at me with an expression I recognized. It was the expression we used to call the confirmation face, the look of someone who hoped they were wrong and is not. "Di," she said. "This isn't negligence. This is a pattern." I said I knew. She said, "There's something else you should look at." She had been doing her own research while I was reviewing the documents. She had pulled a case from 4 years earlier, a VA benefits dispute that had passed across her desk briefly before she retired, one she had flagged as unusual and then lost track of when another case consumed her. A warrant officer named Gerald Pruitt, 71 years old at the time of the filing. The pattern was identical. A legal guardianship petition filed by a third party. A VA medical summary attached that documented progressive cognitive decline. Financial control transferred within 60 days of the filing. The third party in the Pruitt case was listed as a defense consulting firm. The firm's registered agent was Stephen Hargrove. Pruitt had lost his pension. He had been moved to a state-funded care facility in Winston-Salem. He had died there 2 years later, without family present, without a single challenge to the guardianship ever reaching a judge. The records were clean. There was nothing to investigate, because there was nothing that looked like anything, except a man who had gotten old and needed care. He had been 71 years old. He had served 33 years. I sat in Reyes's kitchen, and I thought about Gerald Pruitt for a long time. About the fact that he had not had what I had, the briefcase, the habit, the 22 years of knowing exactly what documents to request and where to look and what discrepancy to circle in red. About the fact that the only difference between what happened to him and what was happening to me was that I had spent a career preparing, without knowing it, for this exact type of attack. I drove home that night in complete silence. I did not turn on the radio. I thought about Gerald Pruitt, and I felt something that was not grief and not rage, and not the particular cold clarity of a prosecution strategy, but something that sat in the middle of all three. The next morning, I called the office of the Inspector General. The special agent assigned to my case was named Torres. I had not met her before. She had a direct manner and a habit of writing in very small letters, and an expression that gave nothing away, which I appreciated. She came to Andrew Choi's office. I presented the full case over 47 minutes. Torres did not ask a single question while I was speaking. When I finished, she looked at her notes for 30 seconds. Then she looked at me. "Mrs. Walsh," she said, "I need to ask you directly. Do you want us to move on Hargrove now, or do you want to wait?" "Wait," I said. She raised her eyebrows slightly. "Not in disagreement, in professional curiosity. He's been nominated for Military Family of the Year," I said, "at Fort Bragg. 6 weeks from now. 400 people. A significant portion of his professional network. The people he used as a backdrop while he was building this. I want him arrested there." Torres considered this. She was quiet for long enough that I wondered if she was going to tell me that wasn't how it worked. "We'll need him to step onto the stage first," she said. "He'll step onto the stage," I said. "He's been waiting for that stage for a year." Torres nodded. She made a note. She asked one more question. "Do you want to be in the room?" I said yes. She looked at me for one more moment. I could not tell exactly what she was thinking. Then she said, "Do you still have the briefcase?" I put it on the table. She almost smiled. "I want to tell you what those 6 weeks were like, because people always ask about the waiting, and they imagine it as something cinematic, sleepless nights, and paced floors, and the weight of what's coming, pressing on every waking hour. The reality was quieter than that. I woke up at 6 every morning. I made coffee. I read case law for 2 hours, not related to my situation, simply because it was what I had always done, and the routine was a form of structure that I refused to abandon. I went to the library on Tuesdays, where I had been helping a group of veterans navigate their benefits applications, something I had started 3 months earlier, not as a plan, but because someone had asked for help, and the reflex to help was so deep in me that I couldn't locate a reason not to. Stephen continued to attend his events. He continued to post on social media with photographs of himself in community settings, always with a caption that managed to work in some reference to the difficulty of caregiving, to the weight of watching someone you love struggle, to the private sacrifice that no one talks about. He received 40, 60, 80 comments of support on each post. People who knew us, people who had known me during my career, people who had sat in my courtroom and watched me hold a case together with the kind of precision that only comes from years of not flinching. I did not read the comments. I read the posts once each, to document the language, and then I gave them to Torres. 2 weeks before the ceremony, she called me with an update. The investigation had established enough to proceed. The physician's records had been subpoenaed. The notary on the guardianship petition had been interviewed, and had, under questioning, admitted that certain signatures had been witnessed under conditions she now had concerns about. Vanessa Cole had been brought in for a preliminary interview. Torres told me, with the careful neutrality of someone who is not making promises, that Vanessa's cooperation level was something to watch. I told Torres that Vanessa had signed documents that put her in the middle of a federal fraud case involving medical record falsification, elder abuse, and conspiracy. I told her that Vanessa was 28 years younger than Stephen, and had, as far as I could determine from the documents she had signed, been presented with a version of events by Stephen that may not have included all relevant information. Torres said she would keep that in mind. I said, "Don't let her take more than she deserves." Torres paused. Then she said, "That's a fair thing to ask." The night before the ceremony, I sat in the kitchen with the briefcase open on the table, and I went through the documents one more time. Not because I needed to. Because I had spent 22 years preparing for moments like this by treating the final review, not as a ritual of anxiety, but as a professional practice, a confirmation that the work was solid, that the case would hold, that there was nothing I had missed. There was nothing I had missed. I closed the briefcase. I locked it. I set it next to the front door. I went to bed at 10 o'clock and I slept for 7 hours without interruption. The Fayetteville Military Community Excellence Gala was held at a hotel ballroom on a Friday evening in March. The kind of venue that has been hosting military functions for 40 years. A ballroom with the particular carpeting and the particular lighting and the particular arrangement of round tables that is so consistent across the country that you can walk into it without ever having been there and know exactly where the stage is, where the bar is, where the senior officers will sit. I arrived 20 minutes before the program started. I wore civilian clothes, dark trousers, a navy blazer, nothing that drew attention. I found a position near the back wall, slightly to the right of the entrance, where I had a clear sightline to the stage and to the section of the room where Torres and her team would be stationed. The room filled in the way these rooms always fill, the junior officers and their families first, finding seats toward the middle, the senior officers arriving with a slight delay, and moving toward the front with the particular ease of people accustomed to having space made for them. General Marsh arrived with 2 aides and was escorted to the front row of the VIP section. She did not look toward the back of the room when she entered. She sat down and accepted a program from an usher and began reading it. I did not look at her after that. I looked at the stage. Stephen arrived 8 minutes before the program began, with 2 people I recognized from his company. He was wearing a suit that I remembered. Dark gray. A tie that matched exactly the right shade of his eyes, the particular combination he wore when he was presenting himself to people who mattered. He worked the room before sitting down, a handshake here, a brief embrace there, the practiced movement of someone who understands that the moment before an event is when impressions are made. He did not scan toward the back of the room. He never thought to look for me. That was the thing about Stephen. After 11 months of methodically eliminating what he needed to eliminate, after the doctor's appointments and the guardianship filing and the transferred accounts and the quiet campaign of replacement and erasure, he had arrived at a state of genuine confidence. He was not nervous. He was not watchful. He was, as far as I could determine from 60 feet away, simply happy. The program began at 7. There were speeches, an acknowledgement of community service, a video presentation about the history of the award. I stood at the back, and I breathed evenly, and I watched. Stephen was called to the stage at 7:43. He walked up the steps with the particular gait of a man who has been waiting for this specific moment for a long time, unhurried, almost ceremonial, the gait of someone who is already writing the memory as it's happening. He shook hands with the program director. He accepted the framed certificate. He turned to the microphone. He began to speak about service, about sacrifice, about the unexpected challenges that life places in front of even the most prepared among us, about what it means to stand beside someone, when they can no longer stand fully on their own. Diana was the most capable woman I have ever known, he said. His voice was exactly calibrated, warm, reflective, carrying the precise texture of grief that is not quite grief but performs it convincingly. Watching her struggle, watching her lose access to the things that made her who she was has been the hardest thing I've ever done. But it has also been the clearest reminder of why we serve. We serve because we believe in something larger than ourselves. We care because we believe people deserve to be cared for, even when they can no longer ask for it themselves. The applause began. General Marsh stopped clapping. I watched her turn her head. The motion was subtle, a slight pivot, her gaze moving from the stage toward the back of the room. Finding me, holding for a moment. Then she stood up. The movement was deliberate and unhurried. She did not look back at the stage. She moved between the rows of chairs people turned to watch her. Because you notice when a general moves through a room, you cannot help it, and she walked down the center aisle, and she did not stop until she was standing directly in front of me. The room had gone quiet, in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something is happening that no one has a script for. General Marsh stood at attention. She raised her right hand. Colonel Walsh, I had prepared, in a professional sense, for most variables of that evening. I had thought through the timing, the logistics, the contingencies. I had not prepared for the specific sensation of hearing my rank from a general officer in a room full of people who believed I could not manage my own affairs. My throat tightened once. I did not let it do anything else. I stood at attention. I returned the salute. Marsh held it for 3 seconds longer than protocol required. It was not accidental. Behind her, on the stage, I heard the sound of something hitting the floor. The certificate. Stephen had dropped it. The microphone was still on. The room heard his breathing change. It was not a dramatic sound. It was the sound of a man whose understanding of a situation is being rapidly revised in real time, and who does not yet have a response prepared. Torres moved from the right side of the room. She was flanked by 2 agents. They reached the stage steps as Stephen turned toward them. He said something I couldn't hear. The microphone had been pulled away from him at some point. His face had gone the color of drywall. He looked toward the back of the room and found me, and I watched him try to assemble a reaction, and fail. Because there is no reaction available to a person who believed they had eliminated a threat and discovers the threat is standing 50 feet away, having just been saluted by a brigadier general. Torres identified herself. She read the charges. Her voice was even and clear and audible to every person in that room. Attempted financial fraud, forgery of federal medical records, elder financial abuse, conspiracy. The elder abuse charge was for Gerald Pruitt. I had asked Torres to include it. I had asked her specifically to say the name. She said it. Warrant Officer Gerald Pruitt, U.S. Army, retired. In the 4th row, a man in his 60s stood up. I recognized him, a former colleague of Stephen's from Fort Bragg, someone who had attended every gala for 20 years. He stood up and he looked at Stephen on the stage for a moment, and then he picked up his jacket from the back of his chair, and he walked out of the ballroom without saying anything to anyone. The room filled with a sound that is not easily described. Not chaos, something more controlled than chaos. The sound of 400 people processing something simultaneously. Vanessa Cole was arrested in the corridor outside the ballroom 11 minutes later. She did not resist. Torres told me later, without volunteering details she didn't need to share, that Vanessa had asked immediately whether her cooperation would be taken into account. Torres said she had answered that question honestly, and that the conversation had been productive. I stayed in the back of the room until the agents had left with Stephen. Then I found a chair at an empty table and I sat down and I put the briefcase on the table in front of me, and I held it with both hands and I breathed. General Marsh found me there. She sat down across the table without asking permission, which is the prerogative of rank and also, I thought, of someone who has already decided she doesn't need to stand on ceremony. She looked at the briefcase. The cipher case? She said. 4.2 million. I read your brief 3 times when it was circulated. I told my staff it was the clearest piece of legal reasoning I had seen in 20 years. I said, I appreciate that, General. She looked at me. How long did you know him before you saw it? I thought about the question. I saw parts of it earlier than I wanted to admit, I said. The full picture took longer. She nodded. She seemed to find that answer sufficient. She stood to leave. She paused. The pension situation will be straightened out, she said. My office will make sure of it. She left. I sat at the empty table for another few minutes. Then I picked up the briefcase and I walked out. 8 months later, I sat in a federal courtroom in Raleigh, and I watched a judge read the verdict. I did not speak at sentencing. My evidence had already spoken 90 minutes of it, presented with the same structure and precision I had used in 63 courtroom appearances before this one. The judge had not interrupted me. I took that as a professional courtesy. Stephen was convicted on all 4 counts. Vanessa received a reduced sentence in exchange for full cooperation. The medical records from Gerald Pruitt's case were re-examined. His estate, no living family, but a legacy trust he had established before the guardianship was imposed, received partial restitution of the pension he had lost. It was not enough. It was what the law could offer. I drove back to Fayetteville after the verdict. I had already arranged the sale of the house. The paperwork had been sitting in the briefcase for 3 weeks. I drove past the VA clinic where Dr. Ellison's summary had been presented as fact. I drove past the street where Andrew Choi's office was, where I had sat and watched a lawyer turn a monitor toward me and show me a document that explained everything. I drove past the gate of Fort Bragg, where I had spent 11 years of my career. I did not stop anywhere. I was not trying to mark anything or complete anything. I was just driving, and the city was just a city. And the things that had happened in it were already becoming what they always become: evidence, organized and filed and placed in their correct category within the larger record of a life. I moved to Raleigh at the end of April. I rented an apartment 2 blocks from the law school where I had trained. I opened a small pro bono practice for veterans navigating benefits, disputes, pension claims, and guardianship challenges. The cases are not glamorous. The cases are paperwork and phone calls, and sitting across from people who are confused and frightened, and who do not know what documents to request or where to look or what discrepancy to circle in red. I know how to do those things. I spent 22 years learning. The brown briefcase is on my desk. The watch Stephen gave me the day I made Lieutenant Colonel is on my wrist. He gave it to me that morning in the parking lot at Fort Bragg, before the ceremony, before the photographs, before any of it. He said it was to mark what I had achieved. I wore it through every case after that. I wore it in every courtroom. I was wearing it on the night General Marsh saluted me in a hotel ballroom while my ex-husband stood on a stage with a drop certificate at his feet. The watch is mine. It has always been mine. It marks what I achieved. That was true before he said it, and it was true after. And it will continue to be true regardless of anything he believed about ceilings or limits, or what a quiet woman standing at the back of a room is capable of. People ask me whether I was afraid. The honest answer is yes. There were nights in those 11 months when the fear was structural, not the sharp fear of an immediate threat, but the slow, eroding fear of a person who is watching their credibility be systematically dismantled, and is not certain the dismantling can be stopped. The fear that the system would believe what it had been given rather than what was true. The fear that being right would not be enough. But fear and incompetence are not the same thing. Gerald Pruitt was afraid too. And he was not incompetent. He simply did not have what I had: the briefcase, the habit, the 22 years of preparation for exactly this kind of attack. He did not know to make the copies. He did not know to timestamp the moments. He did not know what questions to ask or how to ask them in a way that would produce a useful answer. I think about him often. I think about the 33 years he served, and the way it ended, and the fact that there was no one sitting at the back of a room for him, holding a briefcase, waiting for the right moment. That is what I work on now. The system loses things. You don't have to know how to stop it to decide that you won't.